you all. It's good to see you. I want to begin just letting you know the plan for the address, for us to address this question. Can cycles of history explain our troubled times? We can probably all agree that we're in troubled times, but this begs the question, are these times unique or are they repetitive, cyclical in some way? I also want to explain where this question came from. For me, it came from the fact that every spring for the last 15 years, I have facilitated an adult education course called Great Decisions, both at our local county library and at our Unitarian Fellowship. It's a curriculum produced by the Foreign Policy Association since 1954, and it is America's largest foreign affairs program. This year, we discussed such dispiriting topics as America's retreat from the global system, Trump's tariffs, and the spread of nuclear weapons. By the last class, I was feeling the need to leave participants with some reason for hope in the face of such gloom. And I went looking for that hope. And as has happened before, I found it with Reverend Dr. Todd Eckloff. I'm going to share with you a sermon that Todd gave in January. He was preparing to go on a winter sabbatical and wanting to leave his congregation with some hope in our troubled times. In this sermon, he summarizes a book written in 2020 by a geopolitical analyst named George Friedman called The Storm Before the Calm. Here it is, which predicts that our current storm will end toward the end of this decade and will be followed by returning confidence and prosperity. An optimistic story. So let us hear Todd share this story. I'm going to share my screen and hope to pull this off right. And here.
And remember to enable the audio, direct audio.
Oh, remind me where I do that.
That's when you first start the sharing menu.
Let's stop share.
When you first start the sharing menu, there's a little button, and I think maybe advanced, but let's.
Oh, you're right. Share sound. Thank you. I have done this so many times and now I forget again. Thank you. Okay. And let me know if it's not going to come through.
A major challenge for me these days, as you might imagine, is knowing how much and how little to talk about you know who.
Great, looks
good.
I
do consider it my job to help other concerned liberals cope with the disturbing socio-political reality that we're facing as a nation and its impacts upon our entire world. At the same time, you know who already dominates our attention more than enough. Sometimes it feels like he's all anyone ever talks about. Last Sunday, again, I spoke about some coping mechanisms for life in general, including our current state of the disunion, which were largely inspired by Stoicism. Today, since I will again be away and out of touch throughout February, and because I know that Donald Trump, there I said it, will continue to dominate the headlines in ways that I can't predict, that we can't predict, I want to additionally, again, leave you with reasons for hope that this storm will eventually end. Remember what I said last week about the American buffalo, how it's built to face life head on, and that they tend to move into a storm to get through it faster rather than try to circumvent it. No matter what lies ahead, this may be our best strategy too. So let's push forward and get through this. Now, you're wondering if we can get through it, right? So with this in mind and this analogy in mind, the title of my sermon, The storm before the calm is apropos. Rather than being inspired by the buffalo pushing through the blizzard, however, it's inspired by futurologist, political scientist, and author George Friedman's 2020 book, The Storm Before the Calm: America's Discord, the Crisis of the 2020s, and the Triumph Beyond. Upon reading it, I was especially struck by two things. Firstly, how prescient the book is regarding our current situation, and surprised that it was written before the 2020 election of Biden. Yet Friedman predicted that, quote, in the 2020s, regardless of whether President Trump is reelected, indifference coupled with cynicism will dominate. The crisis of this decade will spring from very real problems, but will also be a crisis of faith in the republic itself. And this is precisely where many of us are today, including people from around the world, worrying and wondering if our American democracy will survive. Secondly, I was greatly encouraged by the feelings of hope reading this book has left me with. Once we get through the storm, there's a bright future ahead of us and our nation, or so Friedman predicts. But hope is not a passive feeling. It's not a mere wish for something to be better, but a feeling that emerges only upon discovering sound reasons to believe that things can get better. Hope is not the same as wishful thinking. Social psychologist Erich Fromm compared hope to pregnancy. There are no guarantees how it will turn out, but a pregnancy gives good reason to believe that a healthy and happy child will be born, which is enough to sustain that hope. To hope, Fromm says, means to be ready at every moment for that which is not yet born. The storm before the calm gives us sound reason to hope that the turmoil we are now facing, difficult a pregnancy as it is, will ultimately lead to a new and better life for us all. Since I don't wish to give a book report, I have decided it best to let Friedman himself do the talking by reciting a few selections from his book that became the reasons for my feelings of hope. The following comments are a patchwork of those remarks, although I'll present them as a cohesive narrative. Perhaps they will inspire you to read The Storm Before the Calm for yourself. But for now, please remember that when he speaks of Trump's presidency in the present tense, he's referring to his first term in office that began in 2016. So with that said, with much gratitude, I present to you George Friedman. The United States is living through a difficult time. Americans are focused on Donald Trump's presidency. His enemies believe him to be corrupt and incompetent. His supporters regard him as the victim of the entrenched elite wanting to destroy him. Much of the tension focuses on Trump as if he alone were the problem or the solution. This is a book that focuses on the underlying process in American history, explaining this moment that we are in within the context of our broader history and putting the current passions into context. It will also explain the very real coming crisis of the 2020s to 2030, and ultimately show how the United States will deal with the pain and confusion and emerge on the other side stronger and more dynamic. At the moment, a series of deep structural changes are taking place in the United States, and those changes are creating profound stresses. The federal government is undergoing a periodic shift in which its operations and traditional relationships to society are changing. That shift is driven by an increasing failure in the system. Simultaneously, the economic system is undergoing a fundamental shift driven partly by an excess of money and a limited opportunity for investment. This, it turns out, results in a massive decline in productivity and growth due to a fall-off of innovation. Between these two stresses and the pressure that emerged from the United States trying to find its balance in a global system, the glue that was holding American society together has weakened and will continue to decline throughout the 2020s. And regardless of who is president, fear and loathing will stalk the land for another decade. This is not the first time this has happened by any means. If we step back and take the long view, there are two major cycles in American history. And by understanding these cycles, we can understand the situation in the United States today. One is the institutional cycle, which has transpired approximately every 80 years. The first institutional cycle began with the end of the Revolutionary War and the drafting of the Constitution in the mid-1780s and ended in 1865 with the Civil War. The second institutional cycle ended 80 years later with the end of World War II. The strains of the next transition are becoming obvious now and will take place around 2025. The second major cycle is the socioeconomic, which has occurred approximately every 50 years. The last shift happened around 1980, when the economic and social dysfunction that began in the 1960s culminated with a fundamental shift in how the economic and social systems functioned. The previous socioeconomic cycle changed in the 1930s after the Great Depression, and before that in the 1880s as the country refocused after the Civil War. We are now facing another period of social and economic instability that will conclude in the late 2020s. In looking at these two major cycles, we see something that we have not seen before. The current institutional cycle will conclude in a crisis around the mid-2020s, and the socioeconomic cycle will end in a crisis within a few years of that. This is the first time in American history that the two cycles will culminate so closely together, practically overlapping. That obviously means that the 2020s will be one of the most difficult periods in American history, particularly when we consider the new and complex role the United States plays in the world, something that was not a factor during those earlier cycles. The Trump administration, therefore, is only the precursor of this period and of what is to come. This is not about Donald Trump, positive or negative. He can be perceived as either bold and brash or incompetent and uncouth. But when we look beyond the details, he and we are simply passengers on the American roller coaster. In 2025, it will be 80 years since the end of World War II. In 2030, it will have been 50 years since Ronald Reagan came to power. I expected the 2020s to be a particularly tense period since, again, these two cycles, the socioeconomic and the institutional, have never bottomed out during the same decade as they are doing so now. There have been terrible moments in American history: the institutional shift ushered in by the Civil War, the socioeconomic shift driven by the Great Depression, and so on. I do not expect civil war. In doubt that there will be a depression, but still, we are in for a rough period. It should be remembered that each of these American socioeconomic cycles ended in a period of confidence and prosperity. The Civil War was followed by a tremendous growth period where 35 years later the United States was producing half of the manufactured goods in the world. World War II was followed by unprecedented growth of a mass professional class, and the Cold War was followed by a tech boom that has transformed the world. I'm not predicting doom. I am predicting an intensely difficult period of time between now and when the next phase of American history begins in the early 2030s, and the period of confidence and prosperity that will follow it. This crisis will last through the 2020s. In 2024, a new president will emerge who represents the values of the declining class. The failure of his presidency yes. You hate to say you want to see somebody fail, but the failure of his presidency, sorry for interrupting you, Mr. Friedman, please continue. The failure of his presidency will bring to power the rising class who will impose a new economic orthodoxy. And finally, in the 2030s, following the storms that began in 2016, a new cycle will emerge. Over the following few years in the 2030s, the political confrontation, social tension, and economic dysfunction will be solved. The cycle will have created a new era, different from the past, but built on the same foundation of invention, and it will endure for another half-century. The American system is built on a weak presidency, coupled with a bully pulpit that allows presidents to appear more important than they are. History is patient, and that patience will be needed until at least 2028, when a failing system will force itself to be replaced. American society and the American economy have a rhythm. Every 50 years or so, they go through a painful and wrenching crisis, and in those times it feels often as if the economy will collapse, and American society with it. Policies that have worked for the previous 50 years stop working, causing significant harm instead. A political and cultural crisis arises, and what had been regarded as common sense is discarded. The political elite insists there's nothing wrong that couldn't be solved with more of the same. And a large segment of the public in great pain disagrees. The old political elite and its outlook on the world is discarded. New values, new policies, and new leaders emerge. Just think about what's happening in New York City right now. That's another, he didn't say that, I did, sorry, I ain't keep interrupting. The new political culture is treated with contempt by the old political elite, who expect to return to power shortly when the public comes to its senses. But only a radically new approach can solve the underlying economic problem. The problem is solved over time. A new common sense is put in place, and America flourishes. Until it is time for the next economic social crisis and the next cycle. What has to be remembered is that the political strife and noise are simply the outer wrapping around deep social and economic dislocation. Politics isn't the engine pushing the system is pushing politics. Roosevelt and Reagan didn't found their eras. The era was in crisis. The crisis could not be solved in conventional ways. A break with the past was essential, and Roosevelt and Reagan presided over what was necessary. To date, there have been 5 of these socioeconomic cycles. The first began with George Washington and ended with John Quincy Adams. The second began with Andrew Jackson and ended with Ulysses S. Grant. The third began with Rutherford B. Hayes and ended with Herbert Hoover. The fourth began with Franklin Roosevelt and ended with Jimmy Carter. The fifth began with Ronald Reagan and will end with someone whose name we do not know yet. But he or she will likely be the elected president in 2028. We have to remember that presidents are simply the street signs. The cycle is working itself out in the murky depths. It has been nearly 40 years since the last cyclical transition occurred. In 1981, Ronald Reagan replaced Jimmy Carter as president, changing economic policy, political elites, and the common sense that had dominated the United States for the 50 years since Roosevelt replaced Herbert Hoover. If a pattern that goes back to the founding holds, the United States is due for its next socioeconomic shift in about 2030. But well before that, the underlying exhaustion of the old era will begin to show itself. Political instability will arise in a decade or so or more before that shift, accompanied by growing economic problems and social divisions. When that crisis matures, it concludes with someone who will be regarded as a failed president, and with the emergence of a new president who does not create the new cycle, but rather permits it to take place. Over the following decade or so, the United States reshapes itself and the new era begins. Donald Trump's election, in fact, signaled the beginning of the lead-up to the fourth institutional cycle and the sixth economic or social cycle. The current institutional model has been increasingly unable to function successfully, and the key lies in redefining the relationship of the federal government itself. The economic and social crisis have created a massive decline in the condition of what had previously been a pillar of American society, the industrial worker. Because there has never been a period when both cycles reach their crisis almost simultaneously, we can once again expect the 2020s to be an exceptionally unstable time. There will be an increasing belief in the coming decades that the federal government is in the hand of conspirators. This distrust will feed into our fear of economic interest generated by the socioeconomic cycle's failure. The Trump election in 2016 announced the coming end of this cycle in an election that signaled both a radical shift and utter gridlock in the system. The 2024 election will be the critical one because it will elect the last president of the Reagan cycle. And that will lead to the election of 2028 that will introduce radical new principles to American governance, both institutional and socioeconomic. The election will be politically decisive, bringing in a president by a significant majority as well as a supporting Congress. The last presidency of the Reagan era will act as a slingshot to that new period. America is a country in which the storm is essential to clear the way for the calm. Because Americans obsessed with the present and future have difficulty remembering the past, they will all believe there has never been a time as uncivil and tense as this one. The permanent thing in America's founding, our rights and the Constitution, serve to drive both the prudence and the recklessness of our country. And it is the combination of these two things that has allowed the United States to evolve over nearly 250 years of stability and chaos. There's no evidence of it ending. The current storm is nothing more than what is normal for this time in American history and in our lives. So thank you, Dr. Friedman, for your brilliant, comprehensive, and encouraging explanation of where we are at, how we got here, and the direction we're heading. There's so much more to the storm before the calm than you heard today, obviously, in just a few minutes. So I hope perhaps you're inspired to read it for yourself. I've only shared enough to help you understand the theory and reasoning that has enabled its author to be so prescient regarding his predictions for the future, now our present, which is itself reason to hope that they will be just as prescient regarding the next few years, and the shift to more functional, prosperous, and pleasant institutional and socioeconomic paradigms beginning by the end of this decade, which, if you think about it, it's not too far away. Most important is his well-reasoned prediction that we will get through this storm that we are now going through and that we must go through. And that imperfect as it will be, at risk of changing metaphors, we can now see a very bright light shining at the end of this long, dark tunnel. What seems like the end of something important right now may be the birth pains of something new and better. It's going to be hard. It's going to be painful. And we cannot merely throw up our hands and wait for it to end. And what's happening right now in Minnesota what's happening right now in Minnesota demands of us, we ought to do what we can to support each other, to mitigate suffering, pain, and injustice. For that is part of what midwifing a promising future requires of us. But this is the storm before the calm. And the only way to get through it is to go through it together. Thank you.
Just to try to clarify some of what he said, and to give you a little more information about George Friedman. George Friedman is a futurist and a geopolitical analyst. He has had, like all people in that field, some successes and some failures. He did predict in 1980 that we would be at war with Japan in 1990, which obviously didn't come to be, fortunately. But more recently, he was one of the very first to predict that Russia would invade Ukraine. And he further predicted that Russia would fail. And certainly at the moment, we're seeing some indications of that. So he's had good news and bad news. But in this case, he, as Todd mentioned, he accurately predicted the chaos that we would be in at the moment. But let me share just a couple of slides with you, if I may, that I hope will help you see this a little more easily. This is
we just lost it there, Joyce.
It's not showing?
It's not showing.
It's on now.
I'm seeing
It's
it.
on. It's just not on full screen. If you want to start the presentation, it'll make it bigger. The presentation view.
Yes, the slide. Thank you. Where do I, slideshow. Yes, I can make it big.
Play from the start.
Did that?
It didn't. Can you
there.
say play?
There
There
we
you
go.
go.
There. Okay, so you can see that the orange are the socioeconomic cycles every 50 years, the blue or green, whatever it looks like to you, the institutional cycles every 80 years. And that they are, as you can see here in the right hand, culminating within a few years of each other. And therefore, that's what he uses to explain the very chaotic time that we are currently in. I want to just share one more slide and point out his institutional cycle. It's noteworthy that the institutional cycles are largely driven by wars. You'll notice the Revolutionary War to the Civil War to World War II, World War II to today, and the Middle East wars we're currently involved in. But what he makes a further point that Todd didn't bring out, but I think is useful, is that the first institutional cycle established a federal government, but left its relation to the state somewhat murky. The Civil War to World War II, after World War II, that established the authority of the federal government over the states, certainly involving taxation, for example. But since World War II, there's been a dramatic expansion of the authority of the federal government, not only over the states, but over the economy and the society as a whole. Think things like legalizing gay marriage, instituting Social Security, and so on. And as we can see, we're experiencing a backlash against those things now. So I hope that gives you some sense of his prediction. And at the moment, I don't want to spend a lot of time analyzing whether cycles are real or whether he, makes any good points. I want to take time just to answer any clarifying questions. Does anybody have a short question that needs to be explained for us to go further? No? Okay, then Mark has an alternative theory that I'm going to let him talk about. And then I'll take a brief moment after Mark is finished to make some announcements and an appeal, as we usually do. And then we'll move to a Q&A. So I'm going to remove my spotlight and spotlight you, Mark.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joyce.
Where am I? I've lost you, Mark. You're not showing up.
I hope I'm showing up. Let me share screen here. Am I showing up?
There we go.
Yeah, your screen share.
Are you
Okay,
seeing my
yes,
screen?
we are.
So this is not so much an alternate theory so much as perhaps a different perspective on some of the same things that George Friedman was talking about, and I think you'll see that there's some substantial differences. But I want to start with a quote and end with a different version of this quote that you all know, and that is, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And where does this come from, and what does it have to do with cycles? Well, the idea that there are historical cycles in society, growth, flourishing, decay, and collapse, or as many of the authors put it, spring, summer, winter, summer, fall, and winter, is actually quite old. The oldest civilizations in three parts of the world, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Indus Valley, and in China, have had written records for almost 3,000 years, in the Fertile Crescent even longer. And historians have been thinking about what is in common. They've seen many empires rise, flourish, and fall. Polybius, a Greek historian, about 150 BC, really was the first person in the West to sort of formulate this as sort of the seasons of a society or of a nation or of an empire. But the Chinese had been thinking about it in terms of, for at least 1,000 years before that, in terms of the merit of the rulers to rule. You may have heard of the term mandate of heaven, and that was coined about 800 BC by the Zhou dynasty as they took over from the Shang dynasty, and said that the Shang had lost the right to rule because they'd lost the mandate of heaven. So the idea that you can see commonalities in different societies and different cultures is really quite old, and many people many historians have thought in these terms and tried to sort of formalize what these cycles might be like. Most famously in our tradition, Arnold Toynbee, who wrote 6,000 pages describing the cycles of history as he saw them. I'd like to try to flesh out a little bit more about the cycles that underlie what George Friedman was talking about. And I won't necessarily take the very first formulations of them, but he talks about a 50-year cycle of sort of technological development that's related to the idea of Nikolai Kondratiev, who was a Soviet economist. And he saw technological change as the driver of society. So he pointed out that, these periods of expansion and stasis roughly corresponded first to the invention of the steam engine and mechanized spinning, And then second industrial revolution, railways and large-scale steelworks. And then the third industrial revolution of electrification and chemicals around the turn of the 20th century. And then oil and the automobile in the middle of the 20th century, and then finally information technology most recently. And he pointed out that there were these economic cycles that seemed to follow the expansion of new technology within a generation, transformed industry, and led to flourishing, but then the profits were seized by the elites, and there was an expansion of debt and eventually stagnation. So that's one way of thinking about one of these shorter cycles. And then perhaps the most prominent American version of the longer cycle, the institutional and generational cycle, was formulated by Strauss and Howe, where they were starting to look at why were the baby boomers so different from the greatest generation in their attitudes and in their accomplishments. And then they started looking at biographies and attitudes among people throughout American history. And they decided that there were several cycles of, so they think in terms of three major cycles, and each of them having four phases, or what they call turnings. And they typically started out with strong social cohesion, and then as the society starts to flourish, the institutions that mediate social cohesion are attacked in the name of greater freedom or self-realization. And then there's an unraveling as the institutions are unable to cope any longer with the demands of society. And then there's some sort of crisis, which might be a war like the Civil War or some revolution. Now, these sound somewhat similar to what George Friedman's talking about, but you notice that the time scales don't quite fit his. So he has put things into a nice, neat, almost clockwork cycle, and I think that that's something that most historians would find not plausible. But it is plausible that there are cycles, but they may be more like the cycles of let's say wolves and rabbits, that if there's a population explosion of rabbits, then a few years later the wolves or the coyotes will proliferate, and then they will eat down the rabbits, and the rabbits will crash, and then the wolves and the coyotes will crash. And Peter Turchin, who studied as an ecologist, mathematical ecologist, formalized this in terms of feedback that, a flourishing society enables more and more middle-class people to aspire to an elite status, but there just aren't that many elite positions in society. Not everybody can be a leader. As we used to say when I was young, if it's not politically correct anymore, we used to say, everyone wants to be a chief, but nobody wants to be an Indian. And so as you have a rising proportion of entitled elites fighting for this, the few positions that are left, then that drives a society's coherence down. So you see in all of these the similar sets of ideas about solidarity giving rise to individualism, polarization, and competition, but you don't see necessarily the same, the same time scales. They're not like a clockwork. And I think it's fair to say that all society is shaped by factors in tension, as Joyce mentioned. And at various times, some factors balance more than others. But and this is well documented by Robert Putnam's book, The Upswing, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it, about how Americans have come together at certain times in the past. Particularly, he talks about the progressive era under the Roosevelts and into the 1960s, and then periods of greater individualism and dissolution, and asks, what can we do about that? But I'd like to remind you that history is not necessarily guaranteeing a happy ending. And those of you who were at the book club last week, or sorry, at the end of May, remember that peak human, there were many flourishing societies that lasted for, a century or maybe even 2 centuries, but they've all failed. And there's no guarantee that ours will not fail. And so I'd like to end with the full quote from George Santayana, which most of us don't think about, and that is that to really make progress, we need, rather than grasping for change, seeing some bright light of ideology or belief and running toward that light, we need to retain what has happened. And that's why those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And we see this so readily now in the ignorance of the Trump administration. But we're appalled by the savage ignorance of the Trump administration. But you may recall that only 10 years ago, many very progressive thought leaders were also telling us to purge the past, to forget about the past, which was stale, pale, and male, and to drive forward toward the bright light of their of progressive ideas. But I think it may be worth keeping in mind that the greatest flourishing in our Western history, the Renaissance humanist movement, which led to the tremendous revolution in European thought, was first trying to understand the past and trying to at least recover the best of human art and wisdom. And I think that may be the recipe for trying to cope with this chaotic era. And that's it from me. Thanks, Joyce. And I think we will take questions or comments from everyone. So we can remove spotlight and then we're going. Joyce, you're muted. You need to speak up.
Can we take a moment to make some announcements before we launch?
Oh, I apologize. Go ahead, please do.
Give people a chance to get their thoughts together. This has been a lot. Find my slides there. I want to go on to the next one. I want to remind you of some upcoming programs. This Sunday, the 14th, from 4 to 5:30 p.m., is the Discourse Circle, and it will be discussing respectful and difficult listening. The third Saturday worship service on June 20th, this Saturday, next Saturday rather, from 10 to 11:30 a.m. Pacific time, is with Reverend Ken Marino, and the title is Summer Solstice. The book club will meet June 25th, Thursday, from 4:30 to 6:30, and it will be discussing a book called The Broken Code by Jeff Horowitz. The Sorrow and Joys and Sorrows Connection Circle is meeting the last Sunday of the month, June 28th, 4 p.m. And our next Academy panel this Academy program will be a panel discussion. It will be Thursday, July 14th at this same time, 4:30 to 6. And the topic will be, what do we need from liberal religion in the 21st century? Our panel at the moment looks like it will be Kevin McCullough, who is a member of the NAUA board. It will be Twinkle Manning, a minister, many of you know, and my husband, Nils Peterson, who is the president of the board and founding member of the Salish Fellowship, which is just about to celebrate our 2-year anniversary. So, and then I think I have one more slide.
Can I
No, I
mention
don't.
one other announcement, and
Oh,
that is that
please do.
the NAUA, the Forum Circle, I think will be meeting on the 21st, and we will also be talking about the current chaos and how America has come through periods of chaos in the past.
Ah, timely. And just to remind you that the NAUA is a member service organization dedicated to supporting and promoting the practice of liberal religion by embracing freedom, reason, and tolerance, rooted in our commitment to the inherent worth and dignity of every person and all people. If you want to help support the NAUA, you can go to naunitarians.org/support us or use this code to the right. And I will stop there and return to you, Mark, to facilitate the question and answer discussion.
Great. Thank you, Joyce. Very, very nicely done. So please feel free to ask questions. You may direct them either to Joyce or to myself or make a general comment. So I'll call on people in order. Alan, please go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry,
Oh.
Alan and then Ellen.
Okay. So, I mean, thank you for the presentation. I do think that there certainly are cycles that happen, that things are not always, even keel through time. There are many factors. I think the convergence cycles, have some value there. Technology drives a lot of economic change, and that influences society in a lot of ways. But there are obviously social political conflicts that arise that cause major disruptions, whether it's a revolution or civil war, etc. And there are times when international affairs, forms of world wars, and things of this nature are, major disruptors. So I think there certainly are cycles. Things are a little even handed. So hopefully, if we're going through a difficult time, though I don't think this is quite as difficult as the Civil War or
No.
the Revolutionary War, that there will be a time for a more coming together and a better society in our country, in the U.S. I'm talking about here, because I know we have Canadians with us, in the years to come. I think that the Friedman, at least, there was a couple things I mentioned I thought were a little bit incorrect with regard to Friedman, and they said that times like this would be a time where there was a lot of indifference. I don't know that there's a lot of indifference. So that I think may be an incorrect assessment. And also characterize this as a time of low inventions, low ingenuity. I guess I don't remember the exact term, but I think, this is a time where we've gotten a lot of AI developments and how that can change a lot of societies. I don't think it's a time of low, I don't know, inventiveness. So I think there's some, problems with the Friedman analysis. So I do agree that there are cycles, but they may not be, as regular as he says. Enough said.
Thank you, Alan.
And I
Joyce, do
comment
you want to
on.
respond? Go ahead.
I do want to point out that I do think there has been the number of people who didn't vote last time in the last election was enormous compared to previous elections. So I fear that there has been some indifference, at least in voter participation. But your point's well taken. I can only hope George Friedman is right, but we will wait and find out.
Joyce, did Friedman say that there would be less inventiveness or creativity in this period?
Not that I read, but I haven't read the whole thing. No,
It was
I
mentioned
don't remember that.
in Eckloff's presentation. He made that reference to
He
that.
made the point that there is less innovation because I don't know if that is the same thing as creativity, but less innovation. But he attributes that to lack of places to invest. He thinks there's a excess of investment capital and less place to put it because we can't agree.
That's a very interesting question. Let's follow that up later. Ellen
Okay.
Dubin, please.
Okay, this question is for Joyce. Joyce, I'm a little confused on what George Friedman thinks exactly drives the institutional cycle. If it's not our political leaders, then does he think that war is just naturally a cycle, that it will always be such an important, a driving force? I just didn't get how the institutional cycles come to such calamity.
Well, he's arguing that war stimulated a continual change in the relationship between the federal government and states.
So that is the natural cycle.
And over time, every time there was a major war, the Civil War, the Second World War, the federal government gained power relative to states. And in the last cycle, he thinks that it not just legal power, but economic and social power, like as the things I mentioned, instituting Social Security, legalizing gay marriage. Those were social implications that were federally imposed. And
those social changes were drivers of the institutional cycle or the economic cycle?
they were the result of the institutional cycle.
Okay.
The federal government became more and more powerful and created more and more power for itself. The Social Security Administration, for example. Does that make sense? I think that's his argument.
Yeah, the socioeconomic is easier to understand as far as I can understand it, because I can grasp it. But the institutional seems to be a very slow building up until it just cracks or something. Because
go ahead.
Well, I feel like we're at the point now when we're electing people, there seem to be no standards of any kind, for candidates, that we've already reached this point where we're willing to say Democrats no matter what, or Republicans no matter what. We don't care what you've done or who you are or what your character or anything. You just have a label and that's what we want. And that's just contrary to a democracy.
Well, does it make sense that the reason we're so divided is an argument over how much the government should be involved in our lives?
No, I don't think so.
That doesn't, okay.
I don't think that's the dividing thing.
Okay.
I don't. I think it's a general unhappiness and of seeking to blame something or somebody for what's happening in your lot of life. Just
sort of a grievance.
Yes, a grievance, exactly, and a jealousy too.
Okay. Well, we'll be seeing whether George Friedman was right or not. We'll wait and see. I can only hope he's right. We'll come through this, but we'll wait and see.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Joyce. Terry, I think you're next.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say thank you, Joyce, for sharing Todd Eckloff's sermon. I thought I'd listened to my last Todd Eckloff sermon, but I actually have always enjoyed his points. So thank you for bringing it back up. The second perfunctory point I want to make is that I am a Canadian, and part of the Canadian identity is not being American. And so all of the things that I think about are like that. And so I thought that this whole cycle thing based on American milestones through the American history. It's so what do they call it? American exceptionalism. It's like there is no global things, there is no world things. There's just these things that happen in the United States. And I know and I acknowledge that that the American dollar is what 85% of commerce in the states, things or not in the states, in the world, that are enacted in American dollars. But that is changing very rapidly with the euro and with the yuan, and so I think that if we keep looking for cycles within the confines of one country, we will miss the global perspectives. And certainly we know that environmental things, even intelligence or AI or whatever, is not is no longer a national thing. It's a global thing.
Yeah.
And I'll just end by saying that that when we think of how these cycles that we'll just return to normal. I I think
No.
that it will not return to normal for Canadians in the sense that we're very seriously looking at new relationships with the world. And so the fact that America gets its act together by 2028 or whenever the next election is again, that's great, but it isn't really my reality. I mean, it is more than I want to admit, but it isn't all that I want to admit. That's all
No.
I'd like to say. Thanks.
Good point. Yeah. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
But we can all hope America gets its act together.
Yeah, maybe there are bigger factors. Roy
Yeah.
Dickerson, go ahead.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. I thought it was great. One thing that struck me, and it's just kind of a comment, was that the social or the long cycle, the social cycle,
Institutional.
thank you, institutional cycle seems like it's driven by a failure of the institutions to provide what's needed for the country. One case was the Civil War, onward, the country and the people. Whereas the economic cycle, it seems like it's driven by a new generation of technology rather than a failure of the old. It's just that something new is taking its place. So that was just my observation.
Oh, that's an interesting observation. And you're right. George Friedman doesn't mention technology, but it's clear that that's been a major influence. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And Deandra.
Yeah, there's this is so rich that it's kind of hard to know what thread to pull to kind of react to. But there's a couple of things I was thinking about. One of which is the context globally of strong government involvement in people's lives. Really kind of started with the social safety net, in my view, that FDR put in place, to start helping people with the Civilian Conservation Corps in the U.S. and starting to have health care, and the Tennessee Valley Authority for River Management, and Medicare and Medicaid. So the first time that happened was during the Great Depression, when in fact people were both accustomed to working and desperate because they didn't have food, and they had no way of providing for their families. So the cultural practice is that everybody worked and that the government was going to help you get over that bridge, right? And so I think a lot of Western countries in Europe and Canada and other places started looking at these social safety nets and saying, yeah, there's a role for the government in this a role, and most citizens in Western countries and in Canada embraced that and said that's a great thing. It's ironic in the US, to me, that this heavily capitalist mentality that we have here has started and I really say this happened, Newt Gingrich, I think, was very responsible for this when Reagan was president, of like pulling apart, creating a narrative that a social safety net was that government involvement in people's lives was very bad. And so to me, that precipitated this cultural question about whether or not we should be having the government involved. And then when the liberal majority under the Biden and Obama administration started moving into social issues more than government support, it further eroded confidence that the government was making right decisions about people getting into people's lives. And then you have this technology disruption that's happening at the same time with the internet, with social media, now with AI. So I think Friedman's point about social disruption and economic disruption coinciding to create volatility is spot on. Now, the extent to which he's predicting, I would love to say, embrace that and say, oh, this too is going to end pretty soon. If we get through this decade, we'll be okay. I'm not that optimistic. And I think that's a little bit, I'm not, and I think Mark's point was really important, that sometimes the societies don't survive. And what we might see in a decade, we might say, oh, it'll be the end of the Trump era, it'll be the end of whatever's going on here. Whatever we see is going to be really different than what we saw 10 years ago. So I think that our anticipation and ability to look to the future is maybe affected by our gaze, but I think our gaze needs to be adjusted because we're going to have different lenses for what the new normal is going to be in 10 years. So thanks for bearing with that. So I had a hard time trying to figure out which way I wanted to go.
I know you have a lot to say, and Deandra will be, I think, leading the discussion on American, recovery from difficult times in the past. She's a lot of experience with government, has worked in a variety of agencies. I really think it'll be a very good discussion at the forum.
Oh, okay. You remind me of the what now infamous Reagan quote about the worst statement in the world is "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that really did start a different phase of our relationship with our government.
Yeah, if I may also comment on Terry's point and Deandra's point simultaneously, the American government was not the only government to embrace federal support for helping people over difficult humps in their lives. After World War II, when most of Europe lay in ashes, many of the Western governments saw the terrible devastation that fascist ideology operating on, idle minds and idle hands could bring about, and they invested heavily in the welfare state in various forms. They provided good unemployment insurance. They provided Social Security, various forms, and in many cases medical insurance. These were all done across the Western world, not just in the United States, is a way of trying to prevent the next Holocaust, the next devastating war. And I think that we should put, as Terry said, we should put this in a broader global context. But as Deandra said, the federal government in the 30s and the 40s was trying to help people, transitions to independence. They weren't providing indefinite support, and that's, I think, an expectation that's changed as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other thoughts from anyone else? Is anyone, especially someone who's not spoken yet, any thoughts from anyone else? Okay. Well, then I'll thank you. Joyce, do you want to say some last words?
Oh, no, I just want to thank you all for joining us. This is an interesting topic for me, and I appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing you next month when we have this panel on what is it that we need in this time from liberal religion?
So please think about that. What do you want from liberal religion in the 21st century? And is it different from what liberal religion was born as in the 19th century? We have a lot to draw on from that tradition of Unitarians and Universalists, but do we need the same thing, or do we need something new or different at least? So why don't you think about that? Bring your thoughts and your questions. It'll be a short presentation from each panel member, and then we will go into, really wrestling with the issues. So please bring the issues.
Can I jump in with one final ad? Is that we're planning for the summit in the first 2 or 3 days of October, and if you have a topic that you would be willing to present on, like liberal religion, or we're kind of in the stage where we're looking for session topics. We've got a great keynote lined up. The registration is now open. So it's time to start thinking about it, at least on your electronic calendar. But we really hope that some of the people who have starred in the Academy come forth with some new inspirations for summit sessions. So I'll end with that.
And Terry, is it clear yet whether there's going to be an in-person segment?
Well, I think we should leave that to Joanne Craddock, who is right with us now.
I'm hoping there will be. We have at least, but the problem is we don't have that many people who have committed. We have at least 5, but that's not that many. So we have to run a proposal by Alan because it would be at his church. And I'd like to schedule it. And if we don't have enough and we had to cancel, we could just do online only. But I know there are several people who do want to meet in person.
Okay.
Great.
Well, thanks for that.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
now.
Joyce and Mark.
Thank you, Mark and Joyce.
Thank you.
You